The myth that Hitler was a socialist comes from the name of his party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Historians say this was strategic, since post-World War I Germany had strong working-class anger. Hitler used the term socialist to pull support away from real socialist and communist parties and redirect it toward nationalism. National Socialism wasn't built on worker ownership, equal wealth, or class rule. It was built on extreme nationalism, dictatorship, and racial unity. The socialism meant loyalty to the nation, not workers controlling the economy. In a 1923 interview, Hitler said, "Communism is not socialism. Marxism is not socialism. We are not internationalists. Our socialism is national." National Socialism centered on the idea of the Volksgemeinschaft, a racial people's community based on shared ancestry and culture. It rejected class struggle and instead promoted harmony between workers and business owners under state control, a corporatist model with some national syndicalist elements. It opposed communism, liberalism, democracy, and what it called Judeo-capitalism and Judeo-Bolshevism. When the Nazis took power in 1933, they didn't abolish private property or nationalize industry as socialist revolutions typically do. Instead, they cooperated with major industrialists like Krupp and Thyssen, who feared communism and supported the regime in exchange for stability and state contracts. In May 1933, the regime shut down independent trade unions, arrested leaders, eliminated the right to strike, and replaced them with a state-controlled labor system. The first concentration camp, Dachau, initially imprisoned political opponents, especially communists and socialists. Because it rejected both Marxist socialism and liberal capitalism, while maintaining private property under strict state direction, some described National Socialism as a third-position ideology. The medieval people rarely bathed and were filthy myth is false. Full body soaking wasn't common at home, since heating loads of water required time and fuel. But most people washed themselves daily using a basin and a jug. Hand washing before and after meals was expected, especially since plates were often shared. Public bathhouses were common in cities. In the 13th century, Paris had around 30, London and Prague had dozens. These served as a combination of a spa, community center, and cafe or pub, where people gathered to play games, eat, and drink. People used soap made from wood ash and animal fat scented with herbs. Dental care included cloths, hazel twigs, and clove water rinses. Linen undergarments absorbed sweat and oils and were changed regularly to reduce bad smells. The myth mainly comes from later periods. After the Black Death in the 14th century, many believed hot water opened pores to bad air. In the late 15th century, the spread of syphilis led authorities to close bathhouses, linking them to disease and immorality. By the 17th century, some nobles bathed less and relied on perfume and fresh linen, though ordinary people still washed. Spartans threw weak babies off cliffs. This myth comes from Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus, written centuries after Sparta's peak. He described Spartan elders inspecting newborns. If a baby was judged ill-born, it was sent to the Apothetae, a chasm at Mount Taygetus. However, excavations at the pit found no newborn remains, but mainly bones from adolescents and adults. Researchers say the site was likely used to dispose of prisoners, traders, or criminals. While Spartan society was known for strict infanticide, evidence suggests unfit babies were abandoned on a hillside rather than thrown to their deaths. George Washington's teeth. Washington had severe dental disease. He lost his first tooth in his 20s and had only one natural tooth left by his inauguration. He was given calomel, a mercury-based drug that damaged gums, and used tooth powders made from harsh abrasives like tree bark and brick dust that wore down enamel. So eventually he needed dentures. But the myth that he had wooden teeth is false. His dentures were made from ivory, gold, lead, brass, cow and horse teeth, and real human teeth. The story likely spread because his dentures became stained over time and looked wood-like. Catherine the Great's death. Catherine the Great reigned as Empress of Russia in the 1700s. A common myth claims she was crushed while attempting to have intercourse with a stallion, but there's no historical record of this. The story was likely a smear spread after her death, using her reputation for having many lovers. Another version says she died on the toilet when her seat broke. This twists a real detail. In 1796, at age 67, she suffered a stroke after collapsing in her bathroom. She fell into a coma and died in her bed the next day. The claim that Ferdinand Magellan circumnavigated the world is not accurate. He led the 1519-22 Spanish expedition that achieved the first known circumnavigation, but didn't survive the journey. Magellan planned the route, held the fleet together and led them along South America until they found the passage now called the Strait of Magellan. But he died in the Philippines in 1521, about halfway through, after taking a poison arrow to the neck. The full voyage and return to Spain was completed by Juan Sebastián Elcano. Of the 5 ships that left, only 1 returned and only 18 men survived. The practice of pouring boiling oil on attackers during medieval sieges was very rare. Oil was expensive and valuable as a food and cooking supply, so wasting large amounts made little sense. Instead, defenders used things like boiling water. Heated sand was also effective because it slipped into armor and kept burning. Quicklime caused severe irritation and temporary blindness when it hit moist skin or eyes. Stones and bricks were even more reliable. If something flammable was needed, pitch or resin was more practical than cooking oil because it was sticky. Castle design supported these tactics. Machicolations were stone overhangs with openings that allowed defenders to drop stuff straight down without exposing themselves. But during the First Jewish-Roman War in 67 AD, defenders at Jotfa reportedly poured scalding oil on Roman soldiers. It may also have been used at the Siege of Orleans and the Great Siege of Malta. The idea that Hernán Cortez conquered the Aztec Empire with only his 500 to 600 Spanish soldiers is false. The 1521 fall of Tenochtitlan was only possible because of tens of thousands of indigenous allies, especially the Tlaxcalans, longtime enemies of the Aztec Triple Alliance, who did most of the fighting. Weapons like steel swords, crossbows, cannons and horses gave advantages, but they were not enough to defeat the Aztecs. Massive logistics and blockades over months were needed. The smallpox outbreak in late 1520 was another big factor, which even killed the Aztec ruler Cuitlahuac before the final siege. Cortez also exploited internal political tensions and relied heavily on La Malinche, who acted as translator and intermediary, making alliances possible. The claim that the Aztecs believed Cortez was the returned god Quetzalcoatl is also untrue. The idea that America and South Vietnam lost to rice farmers suggests they were defeated by untrained peasants or only guerrillas. In reality, while many North Vietnamese Army and National Liberation Front, aka Viet Cong fighters, came from farming backgrounds, they were part of organized and well-supplied forces backed by the Soviet Union and China. The Viet Cong were not random villagers picking up rifles, but they also weren't a military juggernaut. They were decisively defeated in 1968 and never recovered from their staggering losses after the failed Tet Offensive. After that, the war increasingly became conventional. In 1972, North Vietnam launched the Easter Offensive, a large-scale invasion using heavy artillery and tanks. Saigon fell in April 1975 in a fast-moving conventional campaign. Rome fell to barbarian hordes. Yes, invasions by Germanic tribes were a major factor in the fall of Rome, but they acted as a multiplier, not the single root cause. By the 300s and 400s, the Western Roman Empire was already weakened by political instability, civil wars, economic strain, leadership chaos, and an overstretched military. Rome had long incorporated foreigners successfully. Trouble escalated after the mistreatment of the Goths in 376, leading to rebellion and the Roman defeat at Adrianople. Rome also increasingly depended on barbarian mercenaries, or foederati, who were often more loyal to their own leaders than to Rome. Unlike the Western Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire allowed capable foreign generals to rise to the top and remained more stable, surviving for another 1,000 years. The Celts were naked barbarians myth comes from Roman propaganda. In reality, most Celts wore clothes and armor. Only some warriors, like the Geisete mercenaries, fought wearing just a belt and a torque to display fearlessness. Moreover, Celts were expert metalworkers, influencing weapons like the spata, gladius, falcata, and the design behind Roman helmets. They had their own currency, a complex social structure with merchants, warriors, councils, and druids, plus effective military tactics and cavalry like the Trimasija. They used soap, groomed their hair, and wore jewelry. Plus, they never used caustic woad to dye themselves. Tattoos existed, likely made from soot for black or copper compounds for green or blue. Marie Antoinette's cake. Marie Antoinette was Queen of France from 1774 until she was executed in 93. A major myth claims she said, "Let them eat cake," when told peasants had no bread, portraying her as indifferent. But there's no evidence she ever said that. The phrase comes from the French "qu'il mange de la brioche," a sweet fluffy bread made with butter and eggs. The earliest known version appears in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions, written in the mid-1760s. He mentioned a great princess, but did not name her. At that time, Marie was a child living in Austria. The quote was pinned on her decades after her death. As an Austrian-born queen with a lavish image, she was an easy target for revolutionaries seeking to vilify the monarchy. Roman gladiator fights. It turns out gladiators were never supposed to fight till their untimely end, since they were valuable investments owned by lanistas, who trained, fed, and housed them. Losing a skilled fighter was costly, so death was not the goal. Estimates suggest roughly 1 in 10 fights ended in death. In some later periods, it may have been closer to 1 in 2. A wounded or disarmed gladiator would usually raise a finger to signal defeat. The final decision was made by the editor, influenced by the crowd. These were regulated events with referees overseeing the match. The organizer wanted drama, not a 30-second slaughter that ended the show early. Legend says 300 Spartans stood alone against the Persian army at Thermopylae. In reality, the battle in 480 BC began with about 7,000 Greek defenders. The 300 Spartans were an important corps, but they were part of a wider coalition. Thermopylae was chosen because it was a narrow pass, limiting how many Persian soldiers could fight at once. This allowed a smaller force to hold back a much larger army. But even in the final phase, it was not just the Spartans. Around 700 Thespians stayed and fought to the death with King Leonidas. The Wild West. Popular culture depicts the American Wild West as a non-stop free-for-all of gunfights and anarchy. That image comes mostly from dime novels, Wild West shows, and later Hollywood. In reality, many frontier towns had strict laws, and homicide rates in some famous wild towns were lower than in many modern cities. Most people were farmers and shopkeepers trying to build stable communities. In places like Tombstone, Arizona, visitors had to check their guns when entering. Crime existed, of course, but towns actively tried to control it through ordinances and enforcement. Chastity belts were common in the Middle Ages. There are many stories of medieval knights locking their wives in belts while on crusades, but there's no solid evidence this was common practice. Most surviving chastity belts in museums are believed to have been made in the 18th and 19th centuries as curiosities or jokes, not authentic medieval devices. The idea spread through art and satire rather than records, like a late 1500s German print showing a woman giving her husband the key to a belt. When urge control mattered, societies relied on social systems, not metal restraints. Communities were small, reputation was critical, and behavior was closely watched. Plus, such padlocks, if worn for long periods, would cause severe infection and death. The sinking of the Titanic is often reduced to one cause: an iceberg. The iceberg was the immediate trigger, but modern research shows the disaster resulted from multiple factors. The common image of a 300-foot gash ripping open the hull is inaccurate. Sonar mapping shows a series of thin, separated tears and buckled plates, totaling about 12 square feet of openings, not one massive hole. Analysis of recovered rivets found they were brittle in cold water. On impact, many rivets popped, allowing hull plates to separate. The steel itself was also vulnerable in near-freezing temperatures, prone to cracking rather than bending. Some argue that a coal bunker fire had been burning for weeks in a fuel store behind one of the ship's boiler rooms before the collision. It may have weakened the hull, reducing its ability to contain flooding. The fire was reportedly known about, but played down. Experts also argue that if the ship had struck the iceberg head-on, it might have survived. Instead, the turn maneuver caused a long glancing blow along the starboard side, breaching multiple compartments. Excessive speed in an ice-heavy region made reacting difficult in the first place. Finally, the watertight bulkheads did not extend high enough. Once several forward compartments filled, water spilled over their tops into the next sections like an ice tray, leading to progressive flooding. The myth that Vikings drank from human skulls comes from a 17th century mistranslation of Old Norse poetry. A line referred to drinking from the curved branches of skulls, which was a metaphor for horns, not craniums. Archaeology backs this up. Real Viking drinking vessels were made from animal horns, wood, glass, or metal. The story persisted because it fit later stereotypes of Vikings as savage raiders. The myth that medieval knights were so heavy in armor they could barely move or needed cranes to mount horses is untrue. In reality, a full plate armor weighed about 20 to 25 kilograms, similar to modern soldiers' gear. The weight was distributed across the body, allowing trained knights to run, climb, roll, and mount horses without help. Historical records show people doing cartwheels and standing up easily in full armor. The image of the helpless knight likely comes from confusion with specialized 16th century jousting armor, which was much heavier and designed for tournaments, not battlefield mobility. The Dark Ages myth. The Dark Ages is a period roughly from 500 to 1000 AD. The term suggests a time of cultural collapse and intellectual stagnation, but most historians now consider it misleading. The label was first used by the 14th century scholar Petrarch, who viewed the centuries after Rome as culturally inferior to classical antiquity. Enlightenment thinkers and some historians reinforced the idea, portraying the era as one in which the Catholic Church suppressed science and reason. While Western Europe did experience urban decline, political fragmentation, feudal structures, and fewer surviving written records compared to Rome, it was not a time of total stagnation. The era saw innovations like the heavy plow, watermills, and windmills. Moreover, during the same time, the Islamic world, China and India saw major advances in science, medicine, and technology with extensive written records. Many historians now prefer the term Early Middle Ages. Shah Jahan's Taj Mahal workers. After building the Taj Mahal in 1632, Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan allegedly severed the hands of 40,000 workers to prevent replicas. However, there is no historical evidence for this. The story is likely a modern tourist myth that resurfaced in the 1960s with no early written sources supporting it. Contemporary records indicate that Taj Mahal artisans and laborers were paid well and continued working on other major projects like the Red Fort and Jama Masjid. Newton's apple. Legend has it an apple hit Isaac Newton on the head and instantly led him to discover his law of gravity. But there's no evidence for that. Newton later told friends and biographers that he saw an apple fall in his garden. Watching it drop made him question why objects fall straight down and not sideways or upward. The head bonk detail was added later to dramatize the story. Julius Caesar's last words. Legend has it that Caesar's famous last words were "Et tu, Brute," but that's false. The phrase became famous through Shakespeare's 1599 play, where it was used for dramatic effect. It likely drew from earlier Renaissance works such as Caesar Interfectus from 1582, not from ancient records. Ancient sources give different accounts. Some say Caesar said nothing at all and simply pulled his toga over his head as he was stabbed. Others suggest he may have spoken the Greek phrase kai su teknon, meaning "you too, child." The idea that medieval people drank only ale or beer because water was universally poisonous is exaggerated. While contaminated water could be a problem in crowded cities or near waste, most people regularly drank plain water from wells, streams, or collected rainwater. People understood basic water quality and avoided stagnant or foul-smelling supplies. Settling, filtering, and boiling were also practiced when needed. Ale and beer were common but were valued for calories and nutrients. Weak, small beer with low alcohol content was widely consumed, including by children as a dietary staple, not a water replacement. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. This myth persists because he created the first practical and commercially viable light bulb in 1879. However, electric light had been in development for over 70 years before his 1880 patent. In 1802, Brit Humphrey Davy created an electric arc lamp. It worked, but it was extremely bright and power-hungry, suited for large spaces, not homes. Englishman Joseph Swan later patented a working incandescent bulb before Edison, but his designs had short lifespans. Edison improved on these designs so the bulb lasted longer and worked reliably, but he also had a big team, so the lone genius myth is also inaccurate.